One quiet afternoon in a suburban Atlanta park, a young black boy living with his blind grandmother sat reading on a worn bench when he suddenly heard a fierce growl. A large dog had broken loose and was charging toward a little girl. Without hesitation, he ran toward her, using his body to shield her, and was severely injured. What he didn't know was that the girl's father was a famous musician who would turn his quiet act of bravery into a song that moved an entire nation. Before we dive in this story, let us know where you're watching from. We love to hear your thought. It was a quiet afternoon in the outskirts of Atlanta, the kind that hung in the air like a soft lullaby, with golden leaves twirling gently from the tired arms of maple trees and settling onto the winding path of the old city park. The park was never busy at that hour. Just a handful of elderly folks on their slow walks, some children accompanied by their nannies, and the occasional jogger moving through with headphones in. But tucked away near the corner bench, just under the large oak tree that shaded more stories than anyone ever bothered to count, sat a boy who came every afternoon like clockwork. His name was Malik. A slender, thoughtful 11-year-old, with skin like polished mahogany and eyes that shimmered with an intelligence far beyond his years. He wore hand-me-down clothes, clean but faded at the seams, and always carried a worn leather book with curled pages and scribbled notes in them. That day, like many others, he sat cross-legged on the bench, reading aloud quietly for his grandmother, Miss Loretta, who was blind but claimed she could see the soul of a story just fine, as long as Malik was the one reading it. Ms. Loretta had raised Malik since he was 3, after the sudden loss of his parents in a car accident on a rainy night he barely remembered. Her hair was silver like the hush of early dawn, and though she walked slowly with a cane, she carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who had seen hardship and had learned to greet it without bitterness. Each afternoon Malik would guide her carefully to their bench, narrate from whatever book he had picked from the church thrift store that week, and then help her home before dark. They didn't have much, just a small wooden house at the edge of the neighborhood and a backyard with overgrown marigolds, but they had ritual. And they had each other. Not far from where Malik read, a little girl with golden curls was hopping across stepping stones near the fountain. She was no more than 8, dressed in a pale yellow dress and tiny white sneakers that sparkled like new pennies. Her name was Lily Whitmore, and though she had just moved into the neighborhood 2 weeks ago, she had already become something of a mystery to the other children who rarely saw her outside. The truth was, her father, James Whitmore, a world-renowned musician who had disappeared from the public eye after the passing of his wife, had brought her here to escape the noise of the world and the ache of a house that echoed too loudly with memories. Lily had seen Malik before, once from the car window when they passed the park, another time from the balcony of their rented house that overlooked the southern edge of the woods. There was something about the way he held the book, the way his voice carried like music when he read aloud to Miss Loretta, that made her inch closer each day, hiding behind benches, pretending to chase butterflies, anything just to listen a little longer. She liked how he pronounced the words carefully, like he knew each syllable had a heart, and though they had never exchanged more than a glance, she had decided in the secret chambers of her young heart that he was like the boys in the fairy tales her mother used to read, quiet, noble, and maybe, just maybe, a little magical. That afternoon, as the sun dipped lower and painted the park in hues of amber and rose, Malik was reading a passage about a brave knight who saved a village with nothing but courage and kindness. Lily, not far away, sat cross-legged on the grass, pretending to stack acorns, but her ears were tuned entirely to his voice. Miss Loretta, smiling softly, tilted her head back as if watching the clouds, though she could no longer see them. The breeze rustled gently. The world at peace. And for a moment, time felt like it had curled up for a nap. But the stillness would not last. Not all stories wait for their chapters to be turned gently. Some arrive with a growl. And that growl was closer than anyone realized. The growl rose up from the other end of the path, low and guttural at first, like the warning hum of a storm just past the horizon. It pierced through the hush of the park with the sharpness of something unnatural, jarring, out of place, and Malik, instinctively, lowered his book and turned his head slightly, brows furrowed. Miss Loretta lifted her face, her smile faltering, her voice barely above a whisper. "Malik, what is that sound?" But Malik didn't answer right away, because his eyes were already scanning the distance, locking onto the blur of motion near the hedge, where the walking trail curved sharply behind the fountain. What he saw made his breath hitch. A massive Rottweiler, muscles taut like wire and eyes wild with panic, had slipped its leash, likely from one of the gated homes nearby where people bought dogs for security more than companionship, and now barreled through the path with no sense of direction, a loose chain swinging from its collar and foam flecking the corners of its mouth. Several grown-ups scattered without hesitation, grabbing their children, knocking over coffee cups and plastic bags in the rush. The few pigeons feeding near the benches took to the air in one explosive flutter, but amid the sudden chaos, one figure remained frozen, small, wide-eyed, utterly unaware of the danger storming toward her. Lily. She had stood to get a better look at the squirrels in the brush when the world around her erupted. She turned just in time to see the dog's charging form, and her body stiffened as if fear had welded her shoes to the ground. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her arms hung limp at her sides. She didn't scream, she didn't run. She simply stared. Malik didn't think. He didn't look around to see who else might move, didn't call out for help, didn't hesitate for even half a breath. He dropped his book, the pages fanning out onto the grass like broken wings, and took off down the path, his sneakers slapping against the concrete with frantic rhythm. Miss Loretta called after him, confusion and panic blending in her voice, but it was already too late. Malik was moving with the raw, unfiltered force of instinct, the kind of courage that doesn't wait to be named. He reached Lily just as the dog lunged, its paws leaving the ground in a feral arc, teeth bared, growl now a deafening roar. He did not shield himself. He turned sideways and threw his arms around Lily, twisting his body so hers would be buried safely behind him. The impact came a second later, a blow so fierce it knocked the air from his lungs and sent both children tumbling to the grass. But Malik never let go. He rolled once, twice, until his back hit the base of the fountain, and the dog's jaws sank into his forearm with a force that ripped a scream from his throat. Pain shot up his arm, searing and electric, but he locked his jaw and tightened his grip around Lily. She was trembling now, clinging to his shirt, sobbing into his chest, too scared to open her eyes. The dog snarled and pulled, trying to free its teeth, tearing deeper with each jerk. Blood soaked through Malik's sleeve and dripped onto the grass. His vision blurred, his ears rang, but he didn't let go. He shifted to keep the animal from reaching Lily's face, curling tighter, gritting his teeth so hard he thought they might crack. Somewhere in the chaos someone shouted for help. Someone screamed for animal control. Feet pounded the path as adults scrambled and hesitated, and then, finally, a sharp whistle cracked through the air, followed by the heavy thud of running boots and the clatter of a pole snapping open. A uniformed park ranger appeared with a catch pole, and within seconds the loop snared the dog's neck and yanked it back with effort. The beast howled, fought, then was dragged away, leaving behind a trail of red drops and a silence thick with breathlessness. Malik lay still for a moment, his face pale, chest rising and falling in shallow gasps, while Lily, still pressed to him, cried out his name, though she had never spoken it before. "Malik! Malik!" she whispered between sobs, over and over, her voice cracking with the kind of guilt only children know. Guilt for not moving, for being small, for needing to be saved. He looked down at her, lips parted, eyes heavy but kind, and managed a faint smile. "You're okay now, that's what matters." And then his head dropped back, eyes closing, the world fading into the sound of sirens echoing through the trees. The last thing he heard was Lily's voice, calling his name, like a thread tying him to the waking world. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft beeping of monitors and the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen valve beside the bed. the kind of ambient sound that lingers like a hush in a church long after the congregation has gone. Malik lay motionless beneath a thin blue blanket, his right arm wrapped tightly in gauze and elevated, faint bruises darkening across his ribs, a butterfly-shaped cut above his eyebrow that had been stitched carefully by a nurse who'd tried her best not to cry as she worked. His skin was pale in the fluorescent light, his small chest rising and falling with a slowness that made even the machines seem hesitant. Beside him sat Miss Loretta, her hand curled gently around his uninjured fingers, whispering prayers that trembled at the edges, prayers that sounded less like supplication and more like a conversation with someone she trusted too deeply to question even now. No one had asked much about Malik when the ambulance had arrived. He had no parents to call, no family contact except an elderly grandmother who had to be escorted into the back of a squad car because she refused, politely but firmly, to let anyone else explain what had happened. The paramedics, though efficient, seemed uncertain about the boy, about what to do with a name that didn't match any school emergency forms or insurance number. And so Malik, brave and bleeding, was taken to the general ward like any child without title or attention, placed in a small corner room at the end of a hallway filled with more prominent cases. Kids with worried parents pacing outside, with bright bouquets and get-well balloons crowding their windowsills. Lily, however, didn't forget. She hadn't stopped shaking until hours later, tucked beneath 3 blankets in her father's arms, her cheeks still damp, her voice hoarse from crying. She didn't say much, not at first, just the name, over and over again, and when James Whitmore finally coaxed her into calm, when he offered her hot cocoa and a lullaby on the same piano he hadn't touched in months, she looked up at him with eyes too old for her age and said, simply, "He saved me, Daddy." And no one even thanked him. James for a moment couldn't speak, because he had seen the boy. Briefly, just as the paramedics pulled him away, just as his own daughter was passed into his arms, he had looked into that boy's face and seen not fear, not anger, but something far more powerful. Resolve, a quiet sort of dignity, the kind that doesn't shout or demand attention but shines in silence, like a candle in a darkened room. And he had let that moment pass. He had turned away. That night, James sat alone in his study, the fire long since gone cold, holding the note Lily had scribbled on her drawing pad, the one with the crayon sketch of a boy with curly hair and a torn sleeve, arms wrapped protectively around a little girl with pigtails and frightened eyes. At the bottom she had written in crooked, determined letters, "Malik is a hero." He traced the name with his fingertip, then stood up slowly, crossed the room and pulled open the drawer where he kept the old press contacts he had tried to forget. Fame had come to him uninvited years ago, through songs that had poured from his grief like rain from a storm-heavy sky, and he had walked away from the spotlight when it began to feel more like a prison than a platform. But now, something stirred in him, something that had been asleep since the day he buried Lily's mother. A sense of duty, perhaps, or just the stubborn ache to make something right. By morning, there were calls. Quiet at first, then a ripple, then a wave. The local hospital director received a polite but pointed inquiry about a boy named Malik, admitted after a dog attack, currently in pediatric recovery without insurance. A modest room was upgraded. A private nurse was assigned. Within hours, the whispers reached the press. They didn't come because of Malik. They came because James Whitmore, the reclusive genius of 3 platinum albums and a decade-long silence, had spoken. But when they came, when the cameras rolled and questions flew, he didn't talk about himself. He told them about a boy. A boy with eyes like firelight who stepped in front of danger without promise of reward, who held no name that the world would recognize but whose heart, in that moment, was larger than the world had room for. And while the cameras clicked and the story spread, Malik slept on, unaware that the world beyond his small window had begun to shift, not because he asked it to, but because for the first time in a long time someone saw his light and refused to let it flicker. Malik awoke 2 days later to the sound of rain tapping gently against the hospital window. the kind of soft, rhythmic drumming that made the world feel far away and almost forgiving. His arm ached, not sharply, but with the heavy dullness of something healing, something bruised but still here, still his. For a long moment he didn't move. He let the strange quiet settle in. So different from the creaking floors of his grandmother's house, the rustle of newspaper pages, the distant radio playing gospel hymns from another room. Then, faintly, he heard her voice, not from a corner seat as he expected, but directly beside him, steady and warm like always, except now with a rasp of emotion she rarely allowed to show. "You came back to me, baby," Miss Loretta whispered, her fingers brushing through his curls with that trembling touch of someone who had learned to love carefully because life had taken too many things too soon. "I knew you would. I told them all you would." He turned his head slowly, still groggy, and saw her face. A little older than he remembered, maybe a little more tired, but smiling, radiant even in the sterile white of the hospital light. He smiled back, weakly but real. He wanted to ask what happened, if Lily was okay, if the dog was gone, but the words tumbled over each other in his throat, and all he could manage was a whisper of, "Are you all right?" Ms. Loretta laughed then, a watery laugh that ended in a sniffle, and nodded, "I am now." But what surprised Malik more than the machines, more than the room that smelled too clean to be home, was the large envelope sitting on the table near his bed, and beside it, a stack of cards, some folded in construction paper, others glittered and drawn in crayon, all addressed in different, sometimes clumsy handwriting, to him. "Open it when you're ready," said a voice from the doorway, calm and rich like velvet worn smooth with time. Malik turned his head and blinked, unsure if the medication was making him dream. Standing there, with his hands folded and eyes soft with something that looked like reverence, was a man he had seen before, on CD covers, in television clips at the barber shop, in posters half peeled on the walls of old record stores, James Whitmore. But he wasn't dressed like a celebrity. No tailored suit, no entourage, no designer sunglasses. Just a man in a gray sweater and a look that said, "Thank you," in more ways than words could carry. "I'm sorry I didn't come sooner," James said, walking slowly toward the bed. "I wanted to, I just didn't know how, to say what needed saying." He paused and then gently placed a small, cloth-wrapped object on Malik's nightstand. "That's a recorder," he explained. "My daughter said you like stories. This one tells yours." And before Malik could ask what he meant, James tapped the top of the device, and it played not music, but Lily's voice, soft and a little shaky, describing what had happened, how Malik had shielded her, how he didn't run, didn't scream, how he wrapped his arms around her and said it would be all right even when he was bleeding. Malik turned away, embarrassed, not used to being spoken about, especially not with admiration. But James leaned in, his voice low and certain. "You're the bravest boy I've ever known, Malik, braver than I ever was at your age. My daughter is alive because of you, and the world needs to hear about it." At that he gestured toward the cards. "They're from people all over. Some don't even know your name yet, but they will." Malik opened one with trembling hands. It was from a boy in Nebraska who had read about him in the paper and wrote, "I wish I could be as brave as you someday." Another was from an elderly couple in Montana. "Thank you for reminding us what courage really looks like." And another, scribbled in crayon from a girl named Emily. "You're my hero. When I grow up, I want to be like you." As the rain continued outside and nurses passed quietly in the hallway, Malik sat with the cards in his lap, the words sinking in slowly like warmth spreading through frost-bitten hands. Miss Loretta leaned closer and kissed his forehead, whispering, "Sometimes the world sees you when you least expect it." And in that moment, with the soft hum of gratitude surrounding him, Malik did not feel small. He did not feel forgotten. He felt, perhaps for the first time in his young life, seen, and more than that, honored. In the days that followed, the hospital no longer felt like a place of cold bedsheets and quiet suffering, but rather something softer, like a threshold, like the pause in a song just before the melody changes. Word of Malik's bravery spread far beyond Atlanta's sleepy neighborhoods, carried by whispers that turned into news segments, which turned into radio tributes and morning talk show mentions. But none of that changed how Malik woke up each morning. Still startled at first, still unsure why so many people now knew his name. The room began to fill, not just with flowers and cards, but with faces. Nurses who came in just to check on him, even when he didn't need checking. A janitor who brought him extra pudding and told him he reminded him of his grandson. And once a woman who cried just from seeing him and whispered something about hope being real again. Malik never quite knew how to respond to any of it. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't know what heroes were supposed to feel like. All he knew was that he had seen someone in danger and his feet had moved before his mind could reason otherwise. It hadn't been courage, at least not the kind people talked about on television. It had been instinct, maybe love, or maybe something quieter and more mysterious. What Miss Loretta once called doing right when no one is watching because your soul won't let you do wrong. And then came the afternoon that changed everything. James Whitmore returned. Not alone this time, but with Lily in tow, her small hand tucked in his, her blonde curls pinned back with a clip shaped like a bluebird. She clutched something to her chest, something wrapped in paper that looked like it had been folded and refolded many times. They entered the room gently, almost reverently, as though stepping into a sanctuary. Lily approached the bed slowly, shy now, her eyes wide and searching, and for a moment neither she nor Malik said a word. Then, without prompting, she stepped forward and handed him the bundle. "I made it for you," she said, her voice soft but steady. Malik peeled back the paper and found a cape, a superhero cape, hand-stitched with crooked lines and colorful patches, clearly cut from one of her father's old concert T-shirts. Across the back, in glittering glue and uneven letters, it read, "My Hero." "I didn't know your favorite color," she added quickly, "so I just used all of them." Malik looked at the cape, then back at Lily, and for a moment his throat felt too tight to speak. He nodded, gently, then reached out his uninjured hand to take hers. She squeezed it without fear this time. There was something unspoken between them now, a thread that bound without needing words. A child's gratitude and another child's sacrifice, wrapped together in something sacred. James cleared his throat, then smiled. A real smile, the kind that reached into his eyes and chased out the long-held sorrow that had lived there since his wife's death. "We were hoping," he began carefully, "that when you're strong enough to leave here, you might consider joining us on stage for something special." He paused, watching Malik's puzzled expression. "I've written a song, Malik, about that day in the park, about you. It's not just music, it's a message. People need to hear what it means to act from the heart." Miss Loretta straightened in her chair, her hand still resting protectively on her grandson's arm. "He's never been on a stage," she said gently, not in objection, but more like a reminder. James nodded. "Neither had I, once." The event was planned quickly, though not rushed. It was to be held in the park, the same park where it all happened, but now with a raised wooden platform, rows of folding chairs, and lanterns strung like fireflies overhead. The mayor would attend, so would news crews, local families, church elders, and school children. But more than any of that, Malik's classmates came, some who had barely known him before, some who had never spoken his name. They came because they had heard the story, and they wanted to see for themselves the boy who had done something most grown men hesitated to do. When Malik took the stage, guided by Miss Loretta on one side and Lily on the other, he wore the cape proudly, its patchwork fluttering in the warm evening breeze. He didn't speak, not at first. James stood beside him with a guitar in hand, adjusting the mic, then gave Malik a nod. And with the first gentle strum of strings, the world seemed to quiet. The song, titled "The Boy in the Cape," wasn't loud or dramatic. It was slow, deliberate, and tender, woven with lyrics that painted Malik not as a myth, but as a child who made a choice when no one asked him to. As the final notes drifted into silence, the crowd stood, not out of obligation, not because they had been prompted, but because something in them recognized truth when they heard it. Malik looked out over the sea of faces, and for the first time he understood what it meant to be seen not for what you have or what you wear, but for who you are, when the world turns away. And in that moment, with the stars above him and the cape brushing against the backs of his legs, Malik didn't feel like a boy from the margins of the neighborhood. He felt like what Lily had written across her drawing. He felt, simply and profoundly, like someone who mattered. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.